As we told you earlier, Indigenous Services Canada is making major changes to Jordan's principle. Our Truth in Politics panel is here now to discuss. Jennifer Leywitz is CEO of Pasqua Harbor Strategies, and Negon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Negon, thanks as always. We're talking about Jordan's principle again this week as there have been many developments. Jennifer, we'll start with you. Indigenous Services Canada saying this week major changes are coming to the program, saying it will no longer cover things like the purchasing of homes, elite sports events or training, international travel. Your thoughts on the changes?
I don't think the changes are a bad thing. I think some changes needed to be had, especially because we've had the conversation around the scope of Jordan's principle maybe being too broad. But when you're not defining what is and isn't acceptable and it's not entirely clear, I can see why all of those things were pushed through. And I think it's now needed to have that conversation again about what is required and what is the purpose and intent of Jordan's principle.
Negon, what do you make of the changes that Indigenous Services Canada is implementing?
It's really evident more of the tremendous, overwhelming, wide needs on First Nations just to provide opportunities that all children deserve who live there, that Canadian children often just accept and take for granted, that you get to be in an urban setting and you have access to all of these different things. The needs of First Nations children still, in this case, while of course I agree with Jennifer that there needs to be some kind of parameters put on the program, there isn't an endless money fountain where money can come out and be able to be provided for what is a exorbitant set of needs that is by all First Nations children, not in any way inappropriate, but certainly a large amount of them. We have to really address the issue of poverty on First Nations and the terrible living conditions that many First Nations children live upon.
Jennifer, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal released a ruling just days before these changes were made public and raised its own concerns, even at one point saying it didn't really matter what the context was, that a lawnmower shouldn't qualify as an urgent need. Are there other examples, do you think, of Jordan's principle being misused?
Yeah, I think there's, I'm not going to be naive enough to say that there wasn't misuse of it. With every program, there's going to be times where programs are going to be misused. That's just the unfortunate reality. But when you have, like Negon had said, so many urgent needs and you're living in poverty and there's so many things happening, at the same time, it's hard to manage all of that. And I could see why so many things were pushed through. But there is that conversation between what is urgent and what is not. And when you have, let's say, a child that is stuck between healthcare jurisdiction where it's a matter of life or death, that is extremely, extremely urgent. But when you're pushing things through, like the purchase of a lawnmower, alongside applications exactly like that, and then the backlog is becoming so big, kids are going to fall through the cracks. So yes, the parameters need to be put in place, and there needs to be a measurement of what is considered urgent and what's not, so that those types of issues are just bogging down the system and kids are potentially not getting the resources that they need.
Yeah, Negon, they were saying that there was a 900% increase in urgent requests for Jordan's principle. And now, everybody's coming out with some of the concerns that the changes in the program, Saskatchewan saying that they're not going to be able to do their food and infant support program anymore because from what they've heard from Jordan's principle, are there going to be some really big issues that happen with these changes?
Oh, we're already seeing it. I was at a conference this week where not only we talked about last week the cutting of EAs, but also the situation where students won't have access to basic health supports necessary to be able to attend school. There is going to be a real impact of these changes. And it's hard, we're in a complicated situation. We have a fading federal government that certainly is going through a massive change, at least of the Liberal leadership race taking place. And then, of course, potentially we're looking at a governmental change with even a party change. So it's hard to take pot shots at this government at the moment because clearly they've also been sort of rejected by many Canadians and judged by many Canadians, according to polls. But really, The fault of this program falls at the feet of the original designers of the Jordan Principle initiative, the programs and services, by not defining early on what would be the expectation of what defines urgent care. What has happened is that over the years, people realized that you could put virtually anything, and of course, everything when it comes to children is urgent. It is about life or death situations. It is about care and showing empathy and kindness towards children in order for them to be successful. And so people eventually started to include everything under the sun that perhaps would be some less urgent than others. But the problem is when you don't define it at the very beginning. I think this falls at the feet of the federal government. And so now coming in restrictingly, and people have already depended on that funding, in many cases already spent that funding, you've created a situation which will be a dire one for many First Nations.
Jennifer, let's start with you. Buffy St. Marie, who recently had her Order of Canada stripped from her. Your thoughts on that?
Ooh, the Buffy St. Marie situation is really unique in the fact that I think this is the most we've seen pretendianism be called out at such an international level. You know, we've seen academics in the space that have been getting called out left, right, and center. But at the same time, I have found since this news first broke, I think it was back in 2023, there's been a lot of conversation around identity and what identity actually means. And there's a lot of people getting the conversation around identity and the sense of belonging almost conflated and confused, because back when that conversation was happening with Buffy St. Marie back in 2023, at the time we were actively seeing communities claim people as their own. And that's part of the problem now is we have the Indian Act bureaucratic view on what identity is. If, you know, like I have a status card and by definition, the government defines my identity. But at the same time, when that first happened, I was kind of on the fence of like, oh, I don't really know the full DNA history there or what's actually factual and what's not. And I kind of wanted to wait to see, is Piapac going to claim her? Are they not going to claim her? Because if they do, there's that conversation around their asserting their self-determination and claiming her as a part of their belonging. But at the end of the day, if you're not Indigenous, you're not Indigenous. And if you've advanced your career and your success off of claiming an identity that essentially at the end of the day doesn't really belong to you, where do we go from there? And I think people need to see those really harsh decisions come down where big awards or big acts of acknowledgement are stripped from people so that they know that it's not okay, because we are hearing about people taking advantage of government programs and grants that are set aside to level that playing field. So I think this was a move in the right direction to really show that, yeah, if your community wants to say that you belong to them, by all means, but at an international or national scale, there's going to be a lot more questions that come down on whether or not that's identified.
Anigan, the Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences says it's still consulting on what should be done with the Juno Awards that Buffy St. Marie won. Thoughts on how to proceed with these awards?
I think Jen's done a really phenomenal job identifying the intricacies and the complicatedness of the situation involving if a community wishes to recognize someone, that doesn't mean the rest of us have to. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, in that it's fine and good to talk about being Indigenous. And, you know, I grew up watching Sesame Street. And I, too, saw Buffy St. Marie as really posing as the only Indigenous face that I ever saw. And certainly as a young Indigenous person, seeing an Indigenous person or a person that was posing to be an Indigenous person on Sesame Street, it was something that it did impact me. It did say that, hey, we can reach certain spaces within the mainstream. We can reach sites in which we win awards and so on. So let's be clear. Buffy St. Marie's legacy will not go away because she has been stripped of awards or there's a determination that she doesn't deserve whatever. And she's already benefited incredibly from having been in a position in which she said that she was Indigenous, got tremendous accolades for it, and then, of course, all these different awards as a result, and has a legacy that is secure. I don't think that her removal will impact much of that, but it will certainly point out to others that you can't just simply claim who you are as Indigenous without any sense of responsibility, or if it's fraudulent or confusing or not clear, you must clear up those things before you do so, or you'll be held accountable. And that I think is the most important lesson out of this.
Moving on, Jen, we did want to touch on the tragedy on Carry the Kettle, Dakota Nation, where 4 people were a victim of a homicide about 10 days ago now. Jen, what's the mood out that way?
I think in Saskatchewan right now, there's worry and there's that sense of where do we go from here? There's a lot of conversations right now about First Nations policing. We are on, the brink of the Saskatchewan Marshal Service coming out. Not really sure what that's going to look like with First Nations. Is this another branch of, law enforcement that we're going to see that could be potentially harmful to our people? Because it seems like right now we're hearing all of these different pieces of the puzzle. We're hearing about tragedies like this taking place on a nation. We're hearing the Marshal Service coming down, but then we're also hearing about the alarming amount of First Nations and Indigenous people that are being hurt or killed at the hands of police. And so I'm a little bit concerned. Addiction is a very, very heavy conversation right now, and so is the breakdown of family, the root cause of crimes. All of those things are coming together, and right now our government isn't functioning. We might see a change in government, and I think that's why this tragedy hasn't been as publicized as it should be, because we discussed whether or not it's hit national media like it should have, but for us in Saskatchewan, it feels very, very close, where all of our friends and family are talking about it on Facebook because our communities are so intertwined. But on a national scale, it's like, is anyone paying attention to what's going on out here? Because it seems like a crisis.
Yeah, earlier in Yvonne, we were just mentioning, we have a reporter out there right now, but hadn't seen a lot of coverage on the national mainstream media about this. Like I mentioned, 10 days out from a quadruple homicide, no arrests. Police say no need to be worried. It was targeted, yet still no arrests. Thoughts on the investigation, Yvonne, and the tragedy here?
Can you imagine if in any urban city, especially the big metropolitan ones, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, that 4 people would be murdered and there would be no one would bat an eye or be interested or engage, or media would barely even send a reporter to cover it? Can you even just imagine that in the realm of possibility? No, because this is certainly indicative that there's a feeling in the country that there's particular areas that are problems are not worth thinking about, or the human lives are maybe lesser than valued than in other areas of the country. And I think that's a real part of this story. It's also a part of the story to say that while RCMP is investigating, and certainly they have a suspect potentially in mind and they've said things like the victims are not part of the plot or the impacts that have resulted in these murders. It certainly is very curious and very concerning that if I was living in a community or even in a province in which 4 people have been killed and no one been charged yet, there would be a mass outcry of concern to wonder, is that person still in the streets? Is that person still in my neighborhood? Is that person? And there would be a manhunt. There would be a massive wide-scale set of resources set aside to come and find who this is. So this either tells me, one, the RCMP isn't thinking in that direction or worried about the public interest, or B, they have someone, they're just trying to collect the evidence. And it certainly seems to be moving very slow.
Jennifer and Yvonne, we'll leave it there for this week. Appreciate you both. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.